okay if I just stand here, okay? Yeah, that's okay. Good. So all this all happened because Lucia was roaming around on the internet and discovered that I got really interested in trying to help other people understand ways of changing how stuff gets done. Because I was able to change how stuff got done when I was working particularly in the United Nations. But I couldn't find a way of teaching other people about it, except about telling my story. And it didn't seem a good idea to do that. And I thought there must be a series of techniques somewhere. And I've always enjoyed looking around and learning about systems theory, because it has always struck me that the kind of issues we deal with globally, because they're super complex, can't be dealt with simply by saying, there's a problem, find the solution, match the solution to the problem, job done. I'm a medical doctor, and there's some weird things in medical education that, despite the fact that the body is a series of systems that are interlocked in quite intriguing ways, we still tend to treat illness using linear thought processes. What's the diagnosis? What's the treatment? Apply the treatment. Does the diagnosis change? Is there a result? And of course, many traditional medical systems, and even a lot of modern medicine, doesn't quite work like that. You recognise that it's all to do with the relationship between the host, or the hosts, which I'll explain in a minute, and various pathogens or other causes, and it's never straightforward. So as I went through my medical training and then worked a lot internationally in the first few years of my professional life, and then went into public health and went to universities, in Britain particularly, and started to learn how to teach public health. I thought, there has to be a better way to do this. And that's when I started to present myself as a person who thinks of everything in life as a series of interacting systems, and who's quite comfortable with the possibility that I can't always explain these systems in precise detail. I can't model them using sophisticated computer methods, but I can feel them. I can learn how to sense the systems that I'm interacting with. And that capacity to feel the systems means that I can also identify patterns, which then means that when I behave in a particular way, things sometimes seem to change. But it's so important that you think in terms of patterns when you're doing this, because so often in health, particularly in public health, just simply doing what seems to be right at the time doesn't necessarily lead to a result. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples from my life, and then I'm going to stop. One is an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa in 2014, 2015. There's an incredible global upset about the fact that the numbers of people with Ebola is doubling every 3 weeks in the 3 countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea. And if you go to the textbooks, the way to deal with Ebola is to have a really good system for identifying people with the symptoms, isolate them super fast, find the people with whom they've been in contact for the last few days, and usually it's about, you want to go back about 10 days, trace those people with whom they've been into contact, follow them carefully, see if any of them are showing symptoms, and if they're ill, isolate them, because you're trying to prevent a disease spreading that is contagious. But we couldn't do that in West Africa when I was put onto the job in July, August 2014, for lots of reasons. The health workers were getting sick and were dying and were scared. The communities were really upset and would, if they saw us coming to their villages, would run away into the jungle, as we called it. And although we were saying, when somebody is showing signs of illness, please don't touch them, they were actually not only touching them, but they were getting super close to them. And if they died, they were getting very, very close to them. And so often funerals became the centrifuge from which people with the disease would emerge and then spread it more and more widely. And I mean, this was becoming a really big deal. We were having meetings in the UN Security Council about it. President Obama came, and we were having real pressure on the United Nations saying this outbreak is terrible and you're not responding to it. And so learning and feeling what was happening, realizing the fear of the people, the fact that the medical personnel were really not finding it possible to continue working. They were so scared. 5% of those who died were health workers. We had to think of different ways of working, engaging with the communities and spending time to get their confidence and trust. Trying, when we isolated people, instead of using thick white plastic sheets and having everybody in moon suits, trying to find ways in which we could actually increase the distance between the healthcare personnel and the patients, but then have the healthcare personnel looking more normal, because the moon suits were so totally scary. Or putting transparent plastic instead of thick white plastic in the treatment units, so that relatives could see their loved ones inside and not feel they'd gone into a kind of prison where they were quite likely to die. And by adapting all the time to the realities of what was happening in the local communities, the realities that you couldn't rely on having lots of health workers because they really were just suffering terribly as a result of the infection. And by trying to make sure that when people came in from outside to help, they behaved with respect, it was possible, amazingly, to stop this thing from becoming a disease that would kill 1 million people across Africa, to being something that we were able to bring under control. It still killed 10,000 people, which is an awful lot. But it's what I'm trying to explain to you. It was feeling and understanding the systems in which we were working. And yes, you could put theoretical labels on it. Yes, we were using an anthropological approach. Yes, we were trying to understand local communities' fears and to respond to those. Yes, we had very, very good epidemiology to help us get the contact tracing right. But the most important thing is that we were looking at that situation as a systems issue. And you may wonder, and you probably will find, that when people start talking about seeing things using the systems point of view, at times you will think, this all sounds rather obscure. And so my advice to you is don't worry if it doesn't make sense. Don't worry. But when you're at home or when you're in your community, just ask yourself sometimes whether the ways of dealing with a situation that work best are not always the obvious ones. So if somebody is doing something you don't want them to do, instead of saying stop doing it, you shift the conversation round so that you have a discussion about why it's being done. And you think about what's the underlying reasons. I mean, that's a very simple thing, and everybody learns those sorts of techniques in life. But it's exactly the same when dealing with major problems. And so gradually over the years, I've done more and more of this, and I've done more and more complex things using this approach. And what I'm going to do in a minute is just talk to you about using this approach on climate change, and something that we've really been doing hard over the last year, because I've been one of the facilitators for a climate summit that took place on the 23rd of September that you were marching in advance of. And I want to talk to you about the approaches we used. And then I want to, for a second, just try to explain that there is a theory behind this. And I'm going to share just some of the elements of that theory. And then I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask you whether any of it makes any sense to you. Now, I didn't recognise it, but there's a guy in the back of the room called Clay. He's actually a really good friend, but he's grown a beard, and so I'm going to have to leave. Oh. And one of the things that, just to give you a little background, when I first met Clay, and we were over in his house in Brooklyn, I think it was then, he was telling me about work he was doing, explaining how the internet makes it possible for totally different connections to emerge. And through those different connections, it's possible to go about addressing problems in very different ways compared with the rather linear approach that you learn in the chemistry class when you're at school. And I suppose, Clay, it's a chance just to give you a shout out, because the books, particularly Here Comes Everybody, were really important in influencing my thinking and helping me to believe that I wasn't completely stupid. So thank you for that. So let's go to climate and the kind of things that we're trying to do. And it may be that this will be easy, maybe it will be hard. And but I like people to stop me when I'm talking, especially if they think that I've missed something out. And I shan't mind at all if somebody says, hang on. But if, and also if you want to just look at me, I shan't mind if you stop me, if you want me to say something, but you don't have to stop me with your words. You can just look at me, catch my eye, and I'll pick it up. So here's the situation on climate that we were dealing with. We've got a level of emissions at the moment, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, that is still far too high, and the impact on global temperatures is possibly greater than the scientific projections that were made by the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we have fairly good evidence that suggests that unless really rapid action is taken within the next 10 years, it's going to be super hard to stick at a 1.5 degrees average increase compared with pre-industrial levels. And that if it does go to 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, the consequences for all people are going to be really awful, but some will get much worse affected than others. And you've probably already become aware of what the impacts are, but just in case anybody you talk to says, that's a problem that's going to come, and within the next 5 or 10 years, scientists will have developed a new machine to capture carbon. So don't worry. I say to you that actually the consequences are coming now, and they're really, really serious. But they don't come in a nice linear way. What we're seeing is the disturbance of a number of systems that are leading to really quite worse situations for people, particularly people who are living lives that are quite on the edge, poorer people. People who live on the edge of the Sahara Desert, for example, in the Sahel. People who live and farm in low-lying delta regions like the Mekong Delta in Vietnam or Nile Delta, where in the Sahel case, the numbers of droughts are on the increase. And what farmers tell me is they just don't know when the rainy season is going to come anymore, and it's leading to real difficulties in farmers being able to plan their cropping and be sure that they'll get a decent income. It's a huge vulnerability due to the volatility of weather. And in these delta regions, we've got saline incursion, which means that productivity of rice paddies is dropping. And then we've got the very obvious things like these really horrible weather episodes that are a result of a much hotter sea than before, that actually leads to much greater moisture going into tropical storms. So it's happening now. And the numbers who are vulnerable is clearly much, much greater than it was 10 years ago, in the millions. But it's mostly poor people who get affected, and they usually tend to suffer and die in silence. And so one of the things that we were thinking about in advance of the summit on the 23rd, which was designed to increase the ambition of countries on climate, was first of all to make it visible to everybody that climate change is happening now and it's hurting millions of people, and it needs attention now, and it cannot be put off. Secondly, we were trying to bring attention to world leaders that there are solutions. Some are well known, like shifting the way in which energy is generated from burning coal and other fossil fuels to using renewables. And we were attempting to explain to policymakers and leaders that this can be done in a way that enables poor people everywhere to access energy at a low price, and that the stuff about renewables not being reliable is actually an untruth that is put around to try to discredit them, because it suits the fossil fuel industries to talk like that. We've also tried to explain that there really is no case at all for any more coal-fired power stations anywhere. And so that 2020 should be the last year in which coal-fired power stations are produced. We're trying to explain that it's time for all automotive transport developers to shift to electricity or other forms of propulsion. We know that that's going to be difficult for air. We still haven't got air right, and it's difficult for marine. We haven't got renewables that can run boats. So there's a lot that needs to be done on energy, but the blockage is simply that the money needed to help poor countries to shift to renewables is just not being made available by the rich countries in the way that they said they would when we were all together in Paris to negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So on energy, we've got the solutions, but we lack the money. On industry, there are some industries that are proving very hard to deal with. Construction, particularly cement, is difficult. Chemicals is difficult. I've already mentioned air transport is difficult. Maritime is difficult, but we're starting to see that there are groups of companies that are prepared to make pledges to reduce their emissions in line with 1.5. And there was some real progress in cement, and there's some real progress in chemicals. And there's some early signs in shipping. It's interesting that some shipping companies are saying, we're going to go carbon neutral by 2050, and we're going to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030, even though they don't know how to do it. They're sort of taking the moonshot approach. A Norwegian company called Maersk, M-A-E-R-S-K, is doing it. So industry has some hope. The part that I was responsible for in the climate summit is a different one. It's called nature-based solutions. It's a terrible term, and I don't want you to get put off by it, because it's the best kept secret in the climate discourse that we have. I first worked on it in 2014 when we had the last climate summit in New York. Then the focus was on forests, and that was the time when we had the New York Declaration on Forests. The basic line being, forests are really good at removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. And we were able then to start the process of reducing deforestation. I think deforestation has reduced a lot since then, but it's still too much. And making sure that forests are kept standing and are not cut down is vital. And the only reason why they've been cut is that the world has not yet found a way to pay communities and nations to keep their forests standing. More money can be made by cutting them down. So we've got work to do on forests, but there's more. You see, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions altogether come from agriculture. And some of you will have seen the publicity about the extraordinary impact of red meat, particularly beef, and the fact that this leads to emissions for lots of reasons. Leads to emissions from the animals, leads to emissions because people cut down forest in order to create more grazing ground, or they cut down forests to produce soy to feed to cattle in intensive production schemes. But it's more than that on agriculture. Rice paddy, if it's not done right, leads to emissions, and so on. So the reason why I was asked to try to create an integrated approach to nature and to bring that into the climate discussion is that actually you can do two things. You can work with nature to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of photosynthesis. You can work with nature to reduce the amount of emissions by changing livestock production and by changing rice paddy and other agricultural things. Plus you can also reduce the amount of food that is wasted. Then there's a third thing, and we found it with Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas recently, that if you leave mangroves in the ground, you know this, you know that story. You leave the mangroves in the ground rather than chopping them down to create nice yacht moorings or something. People living behind the mangroves are protected from storm surges when there's a tropical storm. And we've seen it in Mozambique recently, we saw it in Bahamas. We had a Bahamas survivor came on Sunday and talked about his experience. So nature offers us options for reducing emissions, options for capturing carbon, options for helping people be more resilient. So you could say, well, why on earth isn't nature more strongly in the climate discussions? Answer, don't know, really don't know. But probably there has been insufficient attention to it, and it doesn't receive anything like the funding it should. So my job was to facilitate governments and others bringing nature into climate discussions and committing to invest more in nature, including protecting forests, as a major part of the climate discourse, building on some research findings that suggest that nature could offer up to 1/3 of the climate solution by 2030. It doesn't do anything like that much at the moment. Just to talk to it now about it from a systems perspective. So your job is to facilitate. You're given a really tough assignment to get it into the mainstream for a summit. I started working on it in July last year. Here's how we did it. First, we thought, if this is going to happen, we've got to get some countries to really come in and champion the bringing of nature into the climate discussion. And so the Secretary General of the UN decided, I'm going to go for really the most significant country to do this. And so he spoke to President Xi Jinping of China in the end of last year at what's called the G20. And Xi Jinping said, yeah, I could do that because it fits with our thrust in China for ecological civilization, to shift Chinese development from being profit at all costs, neglect nature, make a mess of the air, to one where they're focusing on China development in harmony with nature. China's saying yes, great, then we need to define some other countries to work with China. And so we went to New Zealand, where Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has developed a thing called the Wellbeing Budget, which is bringing together all the different actors in New Zealand to focus on what the country should be like, not for the old people of my age, but for the young generation. Because she herself is a very young leader. It's not straightforward in New Zealand. They've got an awful lot of cattle and an awful lot of lambs, so the agriculture sector fought a little bit. But China and New Zealand, between them, decided that they wanted to make nature a really central thing in the summit on Monday. So what did they do? The first thing they decided was, we need to create a kind of compass for where we would like nature to be over the next few years. So it took them some weeks. First of all, to get agreement inside their countries as to what the future of nature in development might be. And that meant went to Beijing several times, bringing all different parts of government together, working with them to make sure that China as a country could make nature something that goes across all of the government. And then with New Zealand, they developed a thing called the Nature-Based Solutions Manifesto. It took longer than it should, but it was done. And it's kind of a most remarkable document that describes how China's going to go. So that's like a compass. It shows you what to aim at. It's got it's very short, 2 pages, but it shows what's got to be done. Second thing you do when you're doing this kind of systems work is you create a very big tent to bring in as many actors as possible. But not just governments, you want everybody else as well. And this is why nature is so exciting. At the Youth Summit on Saturday, many of the young people who were there were very clear that for them, a secure future is not just a future where the temperature ceases to rise and rise and rise. It's also a future where living systems are respected, where nature is respected. That's the kind of place where people want to be, where food is sustainable and is healthy, where people living in the countryside get decent wages and are not forced to migrate to the city. It's a very definite feeling among young people everywhere that that is the future they want. So as well as having governments inside the tent, there's lots of youth organisations coming and saying they want nature to be part of the climate action. Then businesses, more and more businesses are saying they want to make sure that they are respecting nature in how they, for example, produce food, or how they do tourism in rural areas, or how they even do mining and other such things. And a lot of businesses, like the chemicals companies like Bayer, who've taken over Monsanto, or fertilizer companies, there's a Norwegian one called Yara, they also say, actually, We don't want to be going on having business practices that just mess the place up. We want to learn to actually be in harmony with nature. So businesses are also coming in. I mean, they have to do it in a transparent way and have to be accountable. And if they're doing bad, they have to be called out. And then businesses like Walmart are saying, we don't want to be destroying any forest in the production of our goods. And they're saying, we want our suppliers to be able to certify that what they're giving us is deforestation free. And pension funds are saying, we don't want to invest in any activities that lead to the destruction of forests. So into this big tent come countries, come young people, come businesses, scientific institutions, universities all over the world, because they're doing the science on which we depend. And then more and more countries are starting to come in. This manifesto was produced a month ago. So far, more than 32 countries have signed on. Some of them are really exciting, like Costa Rica, entire economy based around valuing nature. Indonesia, really pushing back on deforestation and taking people to court if they do illegal logging. Canada, in the middle of an election, but trying its best to get this right. State of California, here, carbon tax and investing in nature. And the number is going on, it's like a snowball. So the big tent is really important when you're doing systems work. And then the third thing that's essential is to offer people the comfort of some organisation. But they're now coming to the 5 core principles of organisation. Number 1, you don't, when you're doing systems work, control everybody. I'm never going to control people to try to get more nature into climate action. But by being one of a number of people working with leaders from China, leaders from New Zealand, leaders from Costa Rica, leaders from Fiji, leaders from companies like Danone or Walmart, and of course from the non-governmental organisations like Nature Conservancy, we're able to get people together with one rule, which is to recognise that everyone has a different perspective on the same issue. Everyone sees the systems around climate action through their own glasses. And we have to be comfortable with the idea that not everybody sees things the same way. Of course, there are certain ways in which people are more likely to see things in similar ways. If they have a common religion, if they have a common or a same academic discipline, or perhaps if they come from the same family, though not always. So you can quite often see groupings of particular ways of looking at systems, but truthfully, you have to be comfortable with the notion that the way in which the system is viewed does vary from person to person. You have to be comfortable with the idea that there isn't an absolute truth when you're doing systems work. And that's tricky for some. It was tricky for me when I started. I struggled with that. What is the right way? And people would say, well, systems people would say, there may not be a right way, but there's ways that seem to get the best result. But different people go about it different ways. And so I have to be comfortable with that. So the first thing in this work, when you've created the big tent and you've got the direction you're going to go in, is to be comfortable with the fact that different individuals and different groups see the situation differently and not to get disturbed about it. Comfort. Secondly, you have to be able to see the totality of the issue. In this case, nature, climate, living systems, climate, living systems and the future of humanity. Sort of seeing things in a very big way, as well as being able to drill down and look at an individual problem, like forests, or like the bleaching of coral, or like livestock, or like food waste. But it's no good just saying, I'm just going to deal with the little details and somebody else can deal with the big picture. You have to be able to do both. And the big pictures are always changing in your minds. I mean, we're very, very connected with each other. We've got social media, we've got news 24 hours over 7. So being comfortable with the big and the small at the same time. That's the second. The third principle is you are trying to bring about a change. Pick your battles carefully. Feel the pace and the rhythm of the situation in which you're working. Sense it. Go with it when you're making the change. It's like if you're a canoeist and you're going down a river. You have to follow the current very carefully. Or if you're a disc jockey and you're playing tunes for your friends, don't go with a standard playlist saying, I'm going to play that playlist, whatever happens. You've got to feel what people want to dance to, or whether they don't want to dance. Sense it. Everybody knows that there are some who do that really well, and there are some who get it wrong all the time, doing bad stuff. So, the third one is feeling the rhythm and the pace when you act. It does mean that sometimes you can't do the things that you most want to do, but it's much better to hold back than to try to do something, meet resistance, and put people off. Fourth thing, when we're working in these international issues, what's right in one country may be totally wrong for another country, because everything varies according to the environment where you are. So when you're working with systems, adapt to the environment in which you're working. Don't come with a standard package. In the old days in health, we used to have these programs where the kind of structure was dreamed up in New York or in Seattle or in Geneva or something, and then people were told, go out and immunize, or go out and do oral rehydration. Just do it. Come back with your numbers. And you'll get a prize if you get the most numbers. That's not the cool way to do it. It's instead go out and feel what people want, can do, would like, and adapt the way you do your stuff to the local circumstances. That's number 4. And number 5, to meet people where they are rather than where you want them to be. That was what we did so carefully in Ebola when we were there in West Africa in 2014-15. If you have in your mind an image of where people should be, and say they should be ready to go into quarantine, they should be ready to accept that they must tell us who they've been in contact with, even if they've been doing stuff they're feeling a bit guilty about or don't want the police to find out about. They should tell us, because that's what's best for the community. If you talk like that, and if you think like that, you will fail. You have to meet people where they are. So these are these 5 principles for systems work that we've been using on the climate summit to get nature in. 1, holding different perspectives, even conflicting perspectives in our heads at the same time, and not being worried about it. 2, seeing the whole of the problem as well as the little details, and recognizing that you've always got to see the whole picture as well as the parts. Thirdly, feeling the pace and the rhythm, the disc jockey approach or the canoeist approach. Fourthly, recognizing that systems vary depending on the environment, and you have to be comfortable about working in the context. And lastly, meeting people right where they are rather than where you want them to be. And just to say that now, where are we? We're Friday, the summit was on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 4 days after the summit. And after lots of follow-up work with businesses, with governments, with non-governmental organisations, the one thing I can say to you is that out of this summit, there was a particular area that really moved forward, and that was the commitment of governments and businesses and young people to really bring nature much more into the centre of what they're doing. It's not there, it's just starting. And when a new way of working emerges, and you're in the middle of feeling that emergence, you never know where it's going to end. You can't say, the end point is when we reach sort of 80 countries, tick, or when we find that sort of 50% of countries have got nature-based budgeting in their ministries of finance. It's nice thinking like that, but it's never as precise as that. It's feeling the movement happening.